Hello everybody, I am Evelil and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. It began on a cold, moonless night in a village tucked deep in the valley. A place where the fog rolled in heavy and thick, swallowing the roads, the trees, and even the houses. It was a village forgotten by time, its inhabitants sparse, its history vague. In the distance, a church stood atop a hill, its silhouette outlined against the dark sky. Though the village had long since been abandoned by the faithful, the church remained a silent sentinel. For years, the place had been the subject of hushed rumors and fearful glances. No one ever visited it. The doors were locked, the windows shuttered. The ground around it was choked with weeds, as if the earth itself had claimed it, hiding its secrets beneath layers of rot and decay. No one truly knew why the villagers had left it behind, but some said it had been abandoned after a terrible event, something that no one spoke of, something that made the souls of those who lived nearby uneasy. But it wasn't just the village's history that bred discomfort, it was what happened on the nights when the fog was thick and the air still. It started small, unnoticed by most, but soon the entire village knew the church was not as empty as it seemed. The first reports were of strange noises coming from the church at night. Low murmurs that turned into whispers, then guttural growls. The sounds carried over the valley like a ghostly lullaby, shivering through the very air. But most terrifying of all were the screams, sharp, high-pitched cries, raw with terror. At first, they were dismissed as the wind or the wail of an animal in pain. But then, as they grew louder, they became impossible to ignore. No one dared go near the church after dark. People claimed they could hear children's voices, soft, almost melodic, yet warped, twisted by an otherworldly resonance. The language they spoke was unfamiliar, guttural, like nothing any living person had ever heard. The cries and whispers blended together, filling the valley with an atmosphere so dense that it seemed to crawl under your skin, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Sophie was a newcomer to the village, an outsider who had arrived only a few months prior. She had heard the stories, of course, the ones the older villagers told in hushed tones by the fire. Her curiosity, however, got the better of her. Sophie was not the kind to be easily scared by old wives' tales, not when the sun was high and the world seemed safe. But on the first night she heard the singing, she froze in place, her blood running cold. It happened as she was returning to her cottage, a small house near the base of the hill. The fog had settled in thick as it often did at night. The air was damp, heavy with moisture, and her footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual in the stillness. She had walked this path countless times before, yet tonight felt different. The silence was suffocating, as though the world had held its breath. Then she heard it. A faint, eerie hum. It was a sound she had never heard before, sharp, dissonant, like the scraping of something unnatural. It came from the church on the hill. Sophie stopped, her heart thudding in her chest as she strained to listen. The sound became clearer, rising like a song, yet not a song at all. It was an arrangement of tones, but each note was warped, jagged, a twisted mockery of music. The more she listened, the more it felt wrong, as though the melody itself was alive, breathing in the night. She took a step forward, drawn by an irresistible force. Her feet moved of their own accord, pulling her up the hill, the fog swirling around her ankles like tendrils of smoke. The nearer she got, the more the sound seemed to thrum through her bones, vibrating in her chest. Then, as she neared the church, she heard it, a scream, followed by a chorus of voices. Children's voices. Sophie froze. It was impossible. There were no children in the village, not anymore. The families had all moved away years ago, and those who remained were old, frail, with no young voices to call their own. Yet these voices, there were dozens of them, or maybe hundreds, a swelling choir of children, their song distorted and choked by something darker, something older. She stepped closer, her feet moving hesitantly, unsure whether she was walking toward the church or away from it. The closer she got, the louder the voices became, until they were no longer singing. They were screaming. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as the cries grew louder, as though the children were right there, just beyond the doors. But when she reached the church, when she looked up at the towering stone walls, she saw no lights. No movement. Just the looming, empty silhouette of the structure against the night. The door was locked, as it always was. Yet, somehow, the sound of the children's voices bled through the walls, as though the church was breathing, as though it were alive. The fog grew thicker around her, and for a moment, Sophie could no longer see the road that led back to her cottage. The fog was closing in, swallowing her whole, drowning out everything except the screams. Suddenly, the cries stopped. Sophie blinked, confused. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the very air had been pulled from her lungs. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run back down the hill, back to the warmth of her cottage. But she didn't move. She stood there, frozen, staring at the church, waiting for something. Then, without warning, the door to the church creaked open. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if something inside was taking its time to respond. Sophie's heart began to pound in her chest, the rhythmic thud of it ringing in her ears. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. And then she saw it. A shadow. At first, it was a vague shape, shifting within the darkness of the doorway, but as it stepped into the moonlight, Sophie's blood ran cold. It was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but the outline of its body seemed wrong, too long, too thin. The air around it shimmered as though reality itself was bending under its presence. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its steps silent but heavy, as though the ground beneath it could not bear its weight. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. The figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at her. A deep, guttural whisper rose from the church. It was the same voice that had been singing earlier, but now it was distorted, a chorus of rasping tones that clawed at her sanity. She could make out no words, but the feeling was unmistakable. This was not human. This was something far older, far darker. The figure took another step forward, and Sophie finally regained control of her legs. She turned and ran. But as she fled, she could hear the voice behind her, louder now, growing in pitch. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a scream, a deafening cacophony that seemed to split the night in two. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled down the hill, the fog now thick as a living thing, curling around her, pulling at her. And in the distance, she could still hear the children singing, their voices distorted and wild, the words twisted and foreign. But the church was silent now. Sophie stumbled back to her cottage, her pulse thundering in her ears, her mind still reeling from the horrors she had witnessed. She slammed the door behind her and bolted it shut, leaning against it as her breathing slowly calmed. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that what she had seen was just a trick of the mind, the image of the shadowy figure and the echo of those children's voices lingered, imprinted in her mind. That night, Sophie barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed to carry the whispers of the church. The fog had not lifted, nor had the eerie calm. By morning, she was exhausted, her mind heavy with exhaustion, her thoughts tangled in confusion and dread. The villagers had warned her not to go near the church. They had all but begged her to stay away. But Sophie had always been the curious type, and now, in the light of day, her curiosity burned brighter than ever. What was happening there? What was it that haunted the old building on the hill? By noon, Sophie couldn't stand it any longer. She decided to return to the church. This time, she would not let fear control her. She would face whatever it was that had sent chills down her spine. She made her way up the hill, the mist still swirling in patches around her feet. The air felt thick, almost electric, and as she approached the church, she noticed something she had not seen the previous night. The doors, once shut tight, were slightly ajar. The gap was just wide enough for a sliver of light to spill out, casting an unnatural glow onto the ground. Sophie hesitated, but only for a moment. The whispers, the distorted cries from the previous night had left her no peace. She needed answers. With a trembling hand, she pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, breaking the silence with a sound that seemed to reverberate through her bones. Inside, the church was shrouded in shadow. The high stone walls towered over her, their coldness almost palpable, their surfaces streaked with dark stains that Sophie couldn't bear to examine too closely. The pews were in disarray, they were chipped and splintered as if something had been dragged across them. And in the center of the room, there was something else. A large stone altar, blackened with soot and time, stood at the far end of the church. But what drew Sophie's attention was not the altar itself, but the strange, thick stains that marred the floor around it. Dark, almost black, they spread out like a pool of ink, stretching toward the walls. Sophie took a step forward, her heart hammering as she tried to gather the courage to investigate further. It was then that she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound, as if something was moving just beyond her vision. She froze. The scratching grew louder. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The fog had drifted in through the open doors, thickening the air. It curled around her, making the shadows feel alive, as if the very church itself was watching her. Then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. A small figure, no taller than a child, emerged from behind a ruined pew. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were wide, far too wide, like black pits, empty and soulless. Its mouth was gaping open, a dark, blood-stained hole that seemed to inhale the very air around it. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movement jerky and unnatural. Sophie stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's head tilted to one side, and then, in a voice that made her insides twist with dread, it spoke. "Help us." The voice was small, childlike, yet filled with a strange, guttural resonance that made Sophie's stomach churn. The figure took another step forward, its hands reaching out in her direction. The darkness seemed to bleed from its skin, curling around the figure like a cloak. Sophie's heart raced and her body screamed for her to run, but she was rooted to the spot, her body betraying her. The figure took another step, its feet dragging across the floor, leaving behind dark, oily smudges. The air grew colder, and Sophie could see her breath in front of her, swirling in the mist. Suddenly, the figure stopped. A loud crack echoed through the church, making Sophie jump in fright. From the corner of the room, the altar shifted. It was slow at first, barely perceptible, but as Sophie watched in horror, the stone structure began to shift and writhe as if something inside it was trying to escape. The scratching sound grew louder. A low, horrible growl rumbled from within the altar, and Sophie's blood ran cold as she realized that whatever was inside was not human. The growl morphed into a scream, no, a shriek, raw and desperate. The walls of the church seemed to tremble as if the very foundation were buckling under the weight of whatever lay trapped beneath the altar. The figure moved again, closer now, its movements jerky and disjointed like a marionette on broken strings. Sophie's pulse hammered in her chest as she turned to run, but before she could take a step, a voice, no, a chorus of voices spoke in unison. Don't leave. The voices were faint at first, but then they grew louder, echoing in the church, seeping into Sophie's mind. She felt them pressing in on her, closing her in from all sides. The fog thickened, enveloping her like a suffocating blanket. She turned back toward the altar, unable to resist the pull of the voices. She watched, paralyzed, as the altar began to split apart, the stone cracking and groaning under the strain. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else, something sickening like rotting flesh. And then, from the gaping wound in the altar, something emerged. It was a figure, massive and twisted, its body blackened and covered in writhing, wriggling shapes. It crawled from the altar with unnatural speed, its limbs contorted, elongated beyond human proportions. Its head was enormous, its mouth filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its eyes were the size of saucers, gleaming with an unnatural light. The figure looked at Sophie, its mouth opening wide in a grotesque grin. And then it spoke. Join us. The scream that followed was not Sophie's. It was a chorus of voices, hundreds, thousands, maybe more, all crying out in pain and terror. They swirled around her, louder and louder, until the very walls of the church seemed to tremble with the sound. And then everything went black. Thank you very much and see you all in the next video. Love you guys.